Hey folks, let's learn something new about the oil and gas industry. All right, today we have Rhod Mackenzie with Rustin Info on. If you've been a listener to the show at any particular time, you know that Rod and I do this every couple of months. We actually recorded one about a month and a half ago that unfortunately, Rod, we lost. I'd like to blame it on some technological problem. It just, the file got handed off to be edited and somebody deleted something and just disappeared. So it's been a little while since we had Rod on the show. But Rod, great to have you back on the show. Here's the deal. What is going on with these damn sanctions and the conflict between the U.S. and Russia?
Well, it's. I think you have to examine the cause before we actually look at the effect. The sanctions really started against Russia in 2014 after what Stratfor, which is the private arm of the CIA, called the most blatant coup in history, and Russia decided that that it was not going to stand for that and allowed the Crimea to rejoin it, which had been part of Russia and the Russian Empire since 1783. That was then called an illegal act under international law, despite the fact that 90% of the people in the Crimea voted to join Russia. We then had the shooting down of over the Ukraine of the airliner, the Malaysian one, MH17, which John Kerry then went on television and various television programs and said, we know who did it and we have the evidence. 4 years on, it'll be 4 years in June, no evidence has been produced. So Russia has been blamed for pretty much anything and everything, including the presidential elections. So sanctions have kept on being ramped up, and Russia has just put up with it and adapted. And I think that's the most important thing, is sanctions have had an effect. The first sort of 3 years, they had quite a dramatic effect on the GDP, which went down by several percentage points, etc. But currently, it is coming back.
Yeah. And so this is one of the things I have an issue with this current political climate. Our news media here, and Europe as well, is they don't always report the truth. They report the stuff that is sensationalized, or they report stuff that gets people emotions involved, but not always the truth. So, you know, I did 4 years in the Marine Corps during the Cold War, during the former Soviet Union. Once that was over, Russia and the U.S. made really, really great allies. If you think all the way back to history to World War II, we would have not won World War II without the help of Russia, right? And so one of the things that really bothers me about this current political climate is the fact that Russia, in some ways, have been kind of pushed to form alliances with OPEC, right? And that bugs the bejeebies out of me. I would much rather Russia and the U.S. be allies in this whole energy world than Russia and OPEC. And Russia is the top producer of oil and gas in the world right now. We're chasing y'all. We're getting close. But you know, when you're that much of the world's economy, that much of the prosperity, because you can't bring a country out of poverty and out of an agrarian society without cheap, abundant, reliable energy. And Russia supplies a lot of that to the world. Before we turned on the camera, you and I were actually talking about coal. I didn't know Russia was the largest exporter of coal in the world.
Yeah, I mean, it's the largest exporter of quite a number of things. Obviously, natural gas, mainly pipeline gas. It's aiming to take 20% of the LNG market in the very near future, with the number of projects currently up and running. But yeah, you're absolutely right. Russia just wants to be a reliable partner.
Yeah, and so if anybody's just the first time they've ever heard you and I talk before, you don't sound like you're Russian.
No, I'm originally from Scotland, but I've actually lived in Russia for 27 years.
Yeah, and so you have, actually, just a quick plug, you have a fascinating business where you gather the data around the projects, the infrastructure projects, whether they're oil and gas, mining, whatever. And if companies want to do business in Russia, they can reach out to you, get the information about these projects so they can actually build on this sort of stuff. It's really cool idea.
Yeah, I have clients in all parts of the world. I even have Russian clients. So
that's funny. So you actually, I didn't know this. This is new. So you actually have Russian clients that want access to your data on the Russian projects.
Yeah, I mean, basically, they want to know what the West is knowing.
Oh no, I get it. Yeah, 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 yeah. So if I was like an EPC, an engineering procurement construction company in Russia, I would want to know what the American, the European EPC companies are looking at in Russia. No, I totally get it. It makes total sense.
Yeah. So I basically work with both sides, and I think that's the best way. You do it yourself with your business, and you try and work with both sides and bring them all together. And that's my major objective: is for a clearer understanding. Your point earlier about the media, it has a complete distorted view of pretty much anything. We've seen that over the last 2 years. As soon as the Russia collusion investigation collapsed with the Senate investigation, immediately you had Skripal, and then you had the Syrian gas attack. It's like, we can't let this go. We have to keep demonizing Russia.
Well, it's what's sad about it is the fact that nobody's reporting the truth, right? It's actually have a lot of friends that are Russian, and you're in that circle. And when I talk to you and I talk to my other Russian friends, what's really going on versus what our media reports is that vastly different, which is just it's just messed up, right? And there's nothing we can do to correct the media. The thing that I also find interesting, though, is this new younger generation that's entering our workforce. None of them pay any attention to conventional media. They don't read the newspapers. They don't buy the magazines. They don't watch the news, right? And so they're out there looking for their truth on their own when they want to see it, which is one of the things we do with these videos, right? So anybody can watch this video anytime they want and understand what's really going on. So I want to kind of go back to the sanctions, because the sanctions have been a big thing politically here in the US. From the Russian side, it caused some impact, but then after a year or two, right, because Russia has a lot of conventional reservoirs, speaking of oil and gas, after a year or two, Russia was able to ramp back up production. So even if the sanctions were something that we wanted to make a difference with, they're really not causing much effect at all now, right?
They haven't had an effect as yet on conventional oil production. What they may have is an effect in 5 to 10 years' time. Because as we know, the cycle within oil is you find it and you extract it, and the time difference between the two is anything up to 10 years.
Right.
So you've done your geological exploration, you've done all your surveys, etc., and then you start putting the business plan together of how do we get it out of the ground and get it to production, the infrastructure, the pipelines, etc., etc. So ExxonMobil is probably the classic example, and it's a local company to you. It was working in the Kara Sea with Rosneft, which is obviously Russia's largest oil company. And after sanctions, they weren't allowed to use the technology that they had joined the partnership with Rosneft to do. So that project has actually been frozen. What they're not taking into account is we actually have a very good oil and gas university here in Ufa, where I am based, and also another major one in Moscow. And these technologies are not specific to the US. China, Russia, etc., are working on these technologies. They don't have them quite yet, but they're not that far away.
Yeah. The other thing that's going to happen is when we talk about oil and gas, when we think of Russia, if we think of the Middle East, we tend to think of conventional reservoirs. The other thing that nobody talks about is Russia has as much, if not more, unconventional hydrocarbons as we do here in the US, right? You have the shale, you have the geology, and the technologies to get that type of hydrocarbon out of the ground economically, it's not rocket science, right? We were the first to get there. Doesn't mean there's not a second, and a third, and a fourth, and a fifth, and a sixth, and a seventh, right? So the amount of hydrocarbons that Russia has at its disposal is enormous, and the Russian people are very good at working and getting stuff and making a dollar.
Absolutely. I mean, we have something called the Bazanov Suite, which is a formation that is very similar to the Permian in Texas, and it probably has roughly the same amount of reserves.
Yeah. And so you're talking about billions and billions of cubic feet of natural gas, tons and tons of liquids, a bunch of crude oil. Right. And the thing that's kind of interesting, I've been watching this for the last couple of years. In the US and Europe, the public sentiment is around the fact that oil and gas isn't needed anymore. And what they don't realize is everything depends on hydrocarbons. The windmill blades are composites made from natural gas. The paint on your bicycle, 72% of what's in a Tesla has hydrocarbons in it, right? So the world has an increase in demand, and you look at things like China. China's actually, I've been really impressed with them. It's they've had an issue with pollution, with air pollution, specifically around cold generated electricity. They're making a switch, Rod. They're switching to natural gas, and it's cleaning up their air, and they're doing it quickly, right? Europe's doing the same thing. You see countries like Germany try to go down the renewable side. What happens is the fact that they actually did not hit their goals, and they had to actually build more coal-fired generation plants to fill in the gaps between the renewables. The solution to all of that is natural gas, and Russia is the predominant natural gas supplier to the UK.
That's what's predominant to Europe. It actually provides something like about 40%. It's between 38 and 40%. And that is also a major issue with sanctions. I mean, sanctions are now being applied to the Nord Stream 2 project on the financing of it. That's to join Nord Stream 1, which goes direct from Russia into Germany. And they're building a second pipeline. That takes 55 billion cubic meters a year straight into Germany, into a pipeline system that then goes all over Europe. Now they're building the second one, and US sanctions are now being applied to people who try and lend money to the financing of that project. Now, that's got nothing to do with the economics of the project, because the first pipeline's practically paid for itself in its 8 years. It's about energy security for Europe, and it doesn't want to be dependent on Russian gas. Despite the fact that the only people who've interrupted the supply of Russian gas to Europe have been the Ukrainians.
It's just so screwed up. And the U.S. is chasing that a little bit too with some LNG exports. It could be interesting to see. We're not there from a maturity curve yet. It's going to be interesting to see about 10 years from now what that world looks like. But it just makes fiscal sense for Europe to buy natural gas from Russia because it's right there, and there's a cost to transport, right? The closer you actually have the supplier, the less the cost of transport is. The other thing that people don't understand is the sanctions that have interfered with the finance in this pipeline. The companies and the people that want to finance this pipeline, that's jobs. They're not financing it because it feels good. They're financing it because they're going to get a return on their investment, right? And that return is profit, and that profit creates jobs. And it bugs me when governments interfere with the private sector to the point that it starts affecting people's ability to have good, high-paying jobs.
I agree with you. I still remember Ronald Reagan's quote. He said, "The most feared words in the English language are, 'I'm from the government and I'm here to help.'"
Yeah, it's my favorite president of all time, by all means. I mean, I don't want to go too far down that road, but he really did some really cool stuff that people don't know about.
I mean, on the gas side, not just Europe, but they're about to, well, by the end of this year, beginning of next, they'll have actually launched what is known as the Power of Siberia pipeline from Siberian gas fields directly into China. Now, that's 3,000 kilometers long.
That's crazy.
Through some of the most hostile climate on the planet,
yes,
where temperatures plunge to -60.
Yeah, so maybe they'll actually be accidentally shipping LNG in the pipeline if they're not careful. It's almost cold enough to bring that gas down to liquid.
Well, back to your comment about LNG. It's not just the transportation cost, it's actually building the regasification plants. So you take a tanker full of LNG somewhere, you've got to build a plant that can then regasify it.
Yeah, there's a whole other side of that infrastructure. So you're absolutely right. So you have to build a terminal that can offload that LNG, and then you have to build the plant that convert that liquid back to a gas, and then that plant has to put it back into the pipeline infrastructure of whatever the country is. You're seeing a lot of work around that all over the world. China is building a lot of regasification plants all over the place. And you're seeing that happen in literally almost all of Asia Pacific, right? Korea, Japan, all that sort of stuff. It is going to be interesting to see what happens with the big Chevron project in Australia once all those Asia Pacific regasification terminals get built.
Well, as we discussed before, the Yamal LNG project is up and running. And it's got a foreign investor. It's got two foreign investors, actually. One is Total out of France, and the other is the CNPC, which is the China National Petroleum Corporation. And that's about 15 million tons a year. There's another 3 plants in the planning, and there's also the Sakhalin project, which does 10.1, and every single piece of that gas goes to the Asia Pacific on long-term contracts.
Yeah, and it just makes fiscal sense, right? It's a good, reliable way to produce electricity for the people. It's good for the environment. It's good for the companies and the people that actually produce the natural gas, and on and on and on. So it's a different value chain in the hydrocarbon world than we've had before, but it's sort of along the same lines, right? We produce energy. Somebody makes a profit off of it. It creates jobs. We ship it to somebody in the world that benefits from it. They're happy with it. So it's kind of a win-win for everybody.
Yeah, and what you have to remember is in these sort of projects and these plants, etc., these are highly skilled operatives. So we're not talking about, minimum wage jobs. We're looking at high-paid, highly qualified, intelligent engineers, physicists, etc.
Yeah, so it's one of the things that we're paying attention to here in the U.S. So you have that whole area of the Pennsylvania. If you drew a big circle around Pennsylvania, Ohio, they have all that natural gas available. Royal Dutch Shell, so Shell is building a big ethylene cracker facility over there. But one of the things that we're paying attention to is when Shell builds an ethylene cracker, that workforce is now going to learn how to build an ethylene cracker, right? So now you have a skilled workforce in that area of the country. Well, what happens next? That means another company can build another ethylene cracker cheaper because now you have that skilled workforce there over and over and over again. I think that part of the U.S. is going to become the petrochemical Detroit, if you want to look at it that way, of the U.S. But that petrochemical, that exporting of plastics and all that sort of stuff, that's going on every place in the world there is oil and gas. One of those places is Russia, right?
Yeah.
So y'all are getting into the export market in a big way.
Yeah, I mean, there's 4 major petrochemical plants under construction, and I did an article today where Russia is looking at something like $15 billion worth of exports from its petrochemical industry up to 2025.
Yeah, that's awesome. Now, I want to do a side note here because you and I talked about this before we turned the camera on.
Yeah.
You just did a big report on gold. I had no idea Russia has that much gold and is exporting that much gold and mining that much gold.
It doesn't export the gold. It goes into the reserves. Rather than foreign currency and buying U.S. treasuries, Russia stockpiles gold. So most of your average, your main Russian gold producers sell it direct at the market price, the current market price, to the Russian central bank. Russia has the 6th largest gold reserves in the world at the moment.
Now, I had no idea that you'll back your currency with gold. We used to do that a long time ago. We stopped doing it, and sometimes that's an issue.
That isn't an issue, and that's always been an issue with fiat currencies. Fiat currencies over the years have always changed. Up until the First World War, the British pound and not the US dollar was the fiat currency around the world used for trade, and it was gold-backed. And the only reason that oil is sold in dollars was Kissinger going to Saudi Arabia in 1973 and convincing Saudis and their local partners to sell oil only in US dollars. And that's why the US has been able to run a 20 trillion level of debt that would have bankrupted most countries around the world.
Yeah, you're dating yourself when you start talking about Kissinger. I remember those days. So let me just throw something out there. So you talk about Saudi Arabia. We're actually talking to Saudi Aramco right now for one of the podcasts. You think they're going to go public? You think they're going to go IPO?
I personally don't think so. I don't think its reserves are as high as it says it is, and I don't think the valuation put on the company by the Saudis is a fair valuation.
Yeah, it's we're watching that really close too. It's that's the same concern I have, is the fact that if you go public, you have to open the books, right? And you have to tell the truth, right? And if you've done business in the Middle East, specifically with Saudi Aramco, a lot of stuff that in the U.S. and in Europe would be considered unethical is a lot of the ways they do business. Well, now they have to expose that. The other thing you're right is the reserves. They talk about the conventional reserves they have, but now they have to prove it, right? They have to actually, it's a legal term, barrels under reserve. So I actually think they will go public, but if they don't, it's for the exact reason that you said, is that they actually have to open the books and tell the truth about stuff.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, it's been a huge oil producer for time immemorial, since the 1930s, and the House of Saud has, lived high on the hog from that. But every oil field, no matter how big, finally comes to its end.
Yep, there's a life cycle, right? And depending, and the thing that's so attractive about the reserves that Saudi Aramco has in the Middle East is they're conventional, which makes them very, very, very inexpensive to get oil on the ground. They basically pump a gallon of seawater in the ground and a gallon of oil comes up. But you're right, if they're on that decline curve of those conventional reservoirs, then it's not as valuable anymore.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a lot of things. Let's go back to sanctions. I mean, sanctions haven't really harmed Russia. It's actually made Russia a lot more self-reliant in quite a number of ways, particularly from a financial perspective. It's now got its own internet payment system, and it could actually be cut off from SWIFT without causing too many problems. Most of the debt of the Russian companies that was dollar-dominated is now in rubles, and very little now. And with the spike in oil, the last time we spoke it was 62, it's 74.5 for Brent. Yes. And we've been talking it up for a year, and every time we talk it up, it gets up. All the doomsayers who tell us we don't know what we're talking about, we're normally correct.
Yeah.
And every single Russian company, not to mention the Russian treasury, are enjoying themselves. They're making more money than they thought they did. Russia budgeted for this year oil at $50. It's 75. So for the first quarter of this year, it's got 25% more revenue coming in the door than it had. All the Russian companies, their EBITDA is up because they're making more money. Their costs are in rubles, they sell in dollars.
Right, which is a margin right there, right? So
correct.
Yeah. So I want to kind of back you up just a little bit, because we talk about the sanctions. One of the reasons that the oil price is where it is because of the cooperation between Russia and OPEC, right, to limit production so that the prices go up. Do you think that cooperation is going to continue?
I think the price of the oil, when it went down to below 40, was actually artificially induced. I think it was a combination of political will from the USA and Saudi Arabia to try and hurt Russia as badly as it could. That plan actually backfired rather badly, not on the Russians but on the Saudis, and they realized that they need oil at $70,
right,
etc., to stop the hemorrhaging of cash. So I think that oil is going to stay above 65, certainly 70 for the foreseeable future.
Yeah,
and Russia may break ranks with that. But we've also got the situation with Venezuela, and we've also got the situation with Libya. Venezuela's oil production is falling off a cliff.
Yeah, it's gone. And what's sad, and we talked about this years ago, what's sad is the people of Venezuela are suffering, right? They can't feed their own people. They have all of these tremendous hydrocarbon reserves, and the government, by basically corruption and screwing people over, gotten themselves in a situation where they can't produce hydrocarbons anymore. And the U.S. has a big appetite for that heavy crude that Venezuela produces, and literally they're trading crude right now for rice and beans to try to feed their people, and it's not working.
Yeah. And they're obviously very indebted to various institutions, particularly the Chinese and the Russians. And I get the impression that from just noises within the political circles in Russia, that even they're beginning to run out of patience with Venezuela.
Yeah, so I firmly believe that somebody big, and it's going to be a government, and it's probably going to be China, and it may be China and Russia, at some point will step in because it makes fiscal sense and start producing that heavy crude. And here's where it gets funny. And they'll sell that heavy crude back to the U.S., right? You would think the U.S. would step in and try to prop that government, or prop another government up for its own benefit. But our political climate right now is so much of this, where nobody wants to get anything accomplished, that we probably won't be able to pull that off.
Yeah, I mean, that's the biggest problem with the USA at the moment is, I mean, we get all the media channels here. I've got 800 cable channels, right? And about 200 of them are in English from various parts of the world. the UK. So I get CNN, I get MSNBC, I get Fox News, I get pretty much everything. And we also cover it on the Russian channels, the outpourings of people. I mean, we have a great chuckle in an evening when you've got somebody like Maxine Walters on the CNN, and she doesn't know the difference between the Crimea and Korea.
It's horrible.
And you've got Nikki Haley, who gets caught by two Russian pranksters telling about the island that doesn't exist, that's a member of the UN in Bonobo, right? And she'll be monitoring the situation. We wonder what we're dealing with. I mean, I don't know if you watched the relationship between Vladimir Putin, Sergei Lavrov, etc. But when they make pronouncements, they actually sound like statesmen.
Yeah, I probably want to leave this one alone because right now I'm not real happy with the way the U.S. administration sounds in the public eye. Not that I don't support them, right? But it's we need some real leaders, right? And those leaders, yeah.
Excuse me, Mark, to be honest, I haven't lived in the UK since the days of Margaret Thatcher. And since Margaret Thatcher left 10 Downing Street in the UK, there's been a succession of charlatans, idiots, and liars, basically. There has been no politician with gravitas and a sense of statesmanship.
Yeah, and I'm right there with you, Rod. I really hope that changes. I actually volunteered this year, and I work for a local politician, just some volunteer work. And I actually got to meet. I supported his position, but I got to meet his opponent. And Rod, I was disappointed. The incumbent, the opponent of the person that I work for, not a very bright person. And it's like, hopefully all our politicians aren't like this. I mean, and then I started talking to some friends of mine, and they go, Mark, the people that have the intelligence and the wherewithal and the drive aren't going to get involved in politics, they're going to get involved in business. And it's like, man, I never thought about that before. Right? So hopefully there's some changes coming both here and in Europe, because we really could use some real leaders.
Yeah, and basically what we in Russia hope for is, and we're actually beginning to lose patience because we keep making overtures to say, okay guys, let's sit down, let's talk, let's resolve these issues. Let's work together to resolve the situation, be it Syria, Iraq, North Korea, etc. But all Russia does, in its good intentions, are rebuffed and then it's reviled, and the politicians and the press continue to do so. It's only when I read people like Tyler Durden at Zero Hedge, Robert Parry, the late Robert Parry, and his successors at Consortium News, Strategic Culture, the wonderful Stephen Cohen. I mean, I don't know if it's Professor Stephen Cohen. He's probably the living expert on Russia in the United States, a professor at New York University. People like those who actually talk sense, who actually have an understanding of the global situation and understand Russia. And Winston Churchill once described Russia as a riddle inside an enigma wrapped in a mystery, right? It can be, but it's actually quite easy to understand. It just wants to get along and people to stop poking it and trying to provoke it into something.
Yeah, it's and we're going to try to actually fix that a little bit. So we still are planning to make a trip to Russia. We'll bring several of the Oil and Gas Global Network hosts to Russia. I want to talk to the real Russian people. I want to report on this. I want to shoot some video. I want to get some audio and bring this back to the rest of the world, because what is portrayed in our media is not the reality in Russia. And like I said, not only do I have no animosity toward Russia, I actually like Russia. I want Russia to be our strong ally like they used to be. And me and my circle of friends feel the same way. Unfortunately, when the media is reporting on stuff in the U.S. back to Russia, they portray it like the Americans don't like Russia, which is not true. And I think the reverse is also not true. I think the Russian people would like to have no animosity toward the Americans, and it's our media that's making this look like there's something going on that's not going on at all.
No, you're absolutely correct, Mark. The Russian people do not hate Americans per se. They laugh and they despise the politicians. They have no animosity whatsoever. There are, as far as I'm aware, at least 50,000 US citizens living in Moscow. And I meet some of them from time to time when I'm in various places on my travels up to Moscow. And not one of them has ever had anything said to them personally. They've had comments about, God, your government is a bit suspect, shall we say. But on a personal level, the people are great. I live in Ufa, and the British Foreign Office put out a report is, be careful when you're in Russia because British citizens might be liable to an attack. I'm attacked all the time by affection.
I love it. I love it. Yeah. So, Rhod, we need to start winding this thing down.
Okay.
Quick plug. If people want to find out more about you and your company, where should they go?
www.russmaninfo.com. I'll put it up at the end. Now, we just got to do the craft beer section.
Okay, let's do the craft beer section. Because craft beer has grown tremendously. Yeah.
It's grown exponentially all over the world, and it's hit Russia. It hit Russia about 5 or 6 years ago, but then it's just grown like a mushroom cloud. So, here we go.
So that's a craft beer in Russia. 4.9% alcohol. Geez, dude.
Yeah, but that's a wheat beer.
Okay.
They're producing a German-style wheat beer locally.
That is so cool.
Yeah, and most of these, Russians like their beer a bit strong.
Well, 4.9% is a very strong beer.
Yeah, I tend to stick to 4% because that's just about my limit,
So, Rhod, let me ask you this. Is the younger generation in Russia moving away from the traditional spirits? Because Russia's always been a vodka, spirits.
Oh, yeah, very much so. I mean, the summers here, people are in the parks and the pavement cafes, almost every spot that has a bit of a green space. Some plastic tables and chairs and a small marquee pops up with a couple of coolers and a couple of kegs, and you have a hot dog and a cold beer, and that's wonderful. It's just people just sit around and watch the world go by of a summer evening and stuff like that. So yeah, so the younger people, as I mentioned in one of our last broadcasts, they do drink spirits, but it's normally Western spirits. I mean, tequila's particularly popular here.
Yeah.
But craft beer is growing. And these are brands from just locally. Yeah. And in very unusual bottles.
Oops. Oh, that's cool. That is really cool.
Another one here. This one, you'll love the label.
Oh, I do love that. Yes. You know what's cool about this is these are entrepreneurs, right? Even though they're selling beer, they're using technology, they're marketing themselves, they're doing stuff with their hands, they're building a business, which is awesome.
That's correct. I mean, basically, all of these are small independents. Not one of them's owned by a major brewery. And I mean, last time I was in Moscow, I went to this particular bar that's just up from Pushkinskaya, which is near the center, which is Pushkin being the poet. And I went to this bar and it had 27 different craft ales on draft.
On draft?
On draft.
Holy shit. Oh, excuse me. Oh, I got to edit that part out. That's a lot of different draft beers.
Yeah. And all of them were about $2.
$2 US?
$2 US for a half liter.
God, that's cheap. All right, so I know where you're taking me when we come to Russia.
I'll take you all over the place. You'll love it. Mark, it's a pleasure as always.
Yeah. So this has been great, Rhod. We're gonna get this out. People, if you're looking to do business in Russia and you want to know what the landscape looks like, reach out to Rhod. Reach out to his company. Great guy. we're planning to make a trip out there. I'm not sure when that's going to happen. We're still working on the details, but this is one of those things where we want to bring the power of the oil and gas global network to Russia so that we can report on what's really going on. And Rhod's been gracious enough to be a friend of ours for a very long time. So we're looking forward to actually meeting you in person, because you and I have never met in person.
It seems as though we've been friends for years.
It does, yeah. So we're going to get out of here. So Rhod, thank you very much for your time. Folks, I hope this helped. We will see you next time.